Today I hope to encourage you to develop a big picture view of 1 Peter. The discipline of studying and working through a book of the Bible, it takes copious amounts of effort, and a significant portion of that comes before you ever dive into the details of its respective verses and their contents. There's a value that is lost when you do not first secure a big picture for the book, and there are various dangers too. The danger of failing to see intended connections and overall flow, the danger of missing the value of elements that are prominent but not primary themes, and the danger of failing to develop your theology book by book of the Bible rather than just volume by volume of a library. So I would encourage you to work at pursuing a big picture of the book as you personally labor with the text. And we're going to do some of this now and in a different way on Sunday as I introduce the book of 1 Peter. But I would encourage everyone to consider looking for and putting together a big picture of 1 Peter and draw that which only comes with time and labor, even more than the details will afford us when they are mined out a piece or two at a time. So walk with me for a few minutes as we look at a big picture of the book of 1 Peter. Now first, I'm going to introduce you to the theme I've drafted for 1 Peter. And I'm going to spend more time on this Sunday, but for now I'm introducing it to show its different role in our study of 1 Peter. It will serve more as a guide as we work through the book, but what I'm advocating here is an effort to develop a parallel tool for you to pick up and use occasionally along the way of our study. So here's our theme. It's sojourners standing firm in the grace of God as expressed in salvation, identity, conduct, suffering, and glory. Again, that's sojourners standing firm in the grace of God as expressed in salvation, identity, conduct, suffering, and glory. Now you also see two images on the screen. The one on the left is quite tiny and not especially useful in its details. The one on the right looks like a Bible-themed subway map or a squished bug. Those are mind maps, or a way to brainstorm on paper. And here they're showing things that I saw consistently addressed throughout 1 Peter. There are certainly other things in the book, but these were the most consistent from my observations, and you might notice that each of the 5 categories individually address each of the other categories within its treatment. So, salvation has much to say about God, believers, suffering, and potentially unbelievers, and maybe not. But if it does not, then I want to see that as I press to see how each of the elements speak to the other. Also, let me explain that thing on the left before we move on. It's the full working out of each of the categories, which became quite full and mildly complex in their expansive expression, and I only provide them to show you a completed project, as it were. Now, some of you have already started putting something together. My provided theme has some key words in it that are not represented on this webby chart. Well, the theme was a partnership of two things: the development of these 5 major elements and the outlining of the book, which together articulate the nuance and application of these elements. Sojourners express the believer's identity. The grace of God actually is a unifying bond of the whole book, but not always overtly spoken to. And glory is plainly present with God, His salvation, the believer's reward, and even that to which suffering will ultimately yield. Now I want to pause here and explain what is coming next and how I hope it will help you. I'm going to go through some more slides or images on your screen and give you some samplings of my main arterial branches off of each subject. And I want you to see further how this is developed, because I want to help you build a tool for our study of 1 Peter together. And yours will likely not look anything like this one. It does not have to, and it probably really shouldn't. We're gifted differently, we work differently, we think differently. Also, this is sideways to try and make the image a little bit more visible for you. It's very, very tiny, stretched out, so I put it sideways. So let's look at some of these together and see if we can't help each other as we walk through this example of this process. A thematic breakdown of God in 1 Peter. So for the sake of time, I'm going to be selective in what I highlight, and I have what I'm addressing literally highlighted on the image so you can see how they are further developed. You can see the arterial branches breaking off and maybe even branches off of that. And so let's walk through some of this. Under God, I have a breakdown of the references to the three persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A few elements under Father were judge, with details coming of this substantial role. You also see reciprocated glory with the Son. You see supplies strength and service, and you also see faithful Creator. A few elements under Son were pictured as a living stone, a cornerstone, patiently endured unjust suffering, the chief shepherd. A few elements under Holy Spirit were sanctifies, gave insight to the prophets, and a comfort to sufferers. For the other categories, I'll just give one example of each. Under salvation, we have Christ's death and resurrection. Under believers, you have response to the humbled. Under suffering, cares for his suffering people. And under unbelievers, face against those who do evil. And with each of these, with all my categories, I also provide the references. So I have a point of reference I can draw back to, look at the text, and see my connections there. Now, the next subjects will be sampled less heavily, as I trust you're getting the idea now. Seeing how a given element is developed and interrelated with the others. Also, for those who want all of my details, I'll gladly make it available on request. I want to make this a two-part tool. If this can be helpful to you, then I'll gladly provide it for you. But I'd also love for you to build something of a like nature for yourself. Again, it doesn't have to look like this, but I'd love for you to develop a tool that you can use as we walk through 1 Peter together. Next, we have salvation. Salvation, and some samples include, under God, you have chosen by God. Under suffering, I have Christ suffering. Under believers, transformation of believers. And notably, under unbelievers, I have nothing. And again, I want to see when there's a lack of overt connection. So my primary theme, obviously, for this section is salvation. And that's not something that an unbeliever is going to enjoy. And I didn't even see any connections that I could tie to it in any regard. Sometimes there are connections, but here I'm grateful that I can see that I didn't observe any. And that's helpful to help build my theology of the book, my theology of salvation, my understanding of unbelievers. So again, it's 1 Peter, and it's really potentially a tool for beyond that as well. Now, some examples under suffering. Under God, why righteous suffering is better. Under believers, suffering for doing good and temporal suffering. Now, suffering is obviously a really big category for 1 Peter, and here it doesn't look like it's gotten a lot of treatment, but we're going to unpack suffering more completely next week. I'm going to more exhaustively look at it, and we're going to look at it obviously as it comes up throughout the book as well. Now, for the next one, the category is believers, and you can immediately see that the book has much to say about and for believers, and that's something that really stood out to me. A book that's so well known about suffering and other major subjects. It has a lot to say about believers and their salvation, our conduct, our identity, how we relate to God, suffering, and even unbelievers. So for just some examples for you, under salvation, redeemed by the blood of Christ. Under conduct, there's a framework of conduct which includes living in view of the end. Also under conduct, calls to righteous expressions of gospel hope. Under God, I have holiness rooted in God's holiness. Under suffering, yields to completed sanctification and glory. Finally, just two examples for unbelievers. Under believers, I have ignorance, silenced by believers doing right. Again, this is how the subjects interrelate with each other. And under conduct, for the major subject of unbelievers, I have contrary to the will of God. And I know that was a blitz of varied details in a very short time, and it was likely hard to follow if you were grabbing for details. But the hope is not so much in your grabbing my details, but seeing the flow of the exercise. An exercise in identifying major elements expressed throughout the book, and you're going to see that by doing a couple of things. Read through the book multiple times, listen to the book multiple times. And an exercise I also did with it one time through the book, when I was working through it in a teaching context, I put the entire book printed on a whiteboard, and I marked next to it on the whiteboard. And I've also printed out the book, and I've written on it in pencil, and I've just tried to draw out and find what themes are coming up, what consistently is repeating itself, whether by word or thematic element or just expression of general content, what could be grouped together. So it takes a good bit of work and a good bit of labor, but it's a profitable exercise. Again, and it's an exercise in identifying major elements throughout the book and then tracing out how they're developed and how they're interconnected. It's not uniquely difficult, it just takes time. And obviously we rely on the Spirit of God as our teacher to help make these things plain. And so what I'm hoping is that this will help you think about how you might develop a like resource for yourself, that you'll do this work. I know in a context in which we're exposed to preaching and teaching, we are students and we sit and we listen, we take notes and we think about it, and sometimes we do some extra diligent work ourselves and maybe read through the book. But this is also a discipleship context, and so I'd love for you to build a tool that would help you as you listen and study and are good students in that context, but also just in the larger context, a good student of the Scriptures. And I think that you'll find that this will be a resource that will sharpen your understanding of the book and elements of theology. A resource that you, once you've developed, it will remain with you. And I use this, I'm using my own exhaustive one every week as I work through the book of 1 Peter, as I'm teaching and preaching through it, and as I'm writing notes and trying to assimilate these things. I'm actually consulting every single branch and element so that my mind isn't getting too myopic and too tightly focused on one given thing, but to continue to keep that broad and rich perspective of the sweep of the book, the theology of the book, the connections within the book. And again, that's something you can do for yourself. And it's a resource that you've developed by relying on going to the text, trusting yourself to the Spirit of God, and that you didn't have to run to a supplemental resource. As valuable as they are, this is a resource you can develop. And again, I know it can be hard, so I'm going to give you two images here, and I want to make sure I properly credit Shel Silverstein in his book Where the Sidewalk Ends, a poem and image here called Melinda May. And these are two images I keep before me and even share with others when I teach discipleship overseas and in various contexts, because discipleship is a lot of work, and it's accomplished one bite at a time. So again, I know it can seem like a lot, and it can seem like, well, you're the one teaching and preaching 1 Peter. Why do I have to do all this work? Because it will yield so much value to your own study and enjoyment of the work, and enjoyment of the book, and enjoyment of our participation together. So I hope that you'll take the time to do that, to look for themes, to look to see how they're interconnected, and to develop your own theology as expressed in the book of 1 Peter. So again, I hope to encourage you, develop a big picture view of 1 Peter. We're going to be in those tiny little details, and they're going to be precious. But let's keep the big picture in view as we zone in on those finer details. All right, grace to you all. Looking forward to our beginning of a precious book together.